Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us at the last episode before the summer break of An Evening With. Today we have a very special guest, and it is my pleasure to have Alberto Brandolini to introduce him. Please, Alberto.
Hello, everybody. I just wanted to be here to introduce Simon Wardley. Why? Because Simon is so damn brilliant, and it was a game changer for me. I saw his presentation live in London a couple of years ago. I saw him again in Amsterdam, and I got what I learned during the presentation. I put it in practice. I started mind mapping a little, mapping actually according to the Wardley Maps, and it was damn working. So I think whatever he's saying is relevant, and I'm so happy finally to have Simon here with us for this presentation, talk, discussion, and an explosion of insights. That's what I'm expecting. That's all for you.
Wow, thank you. I'm so excited as well. Bring this guy on. No, thank you. I mean, gosh, I don't know what to say other than thank you. Wow. I'm glad that mapping has turned out to be useful and helpful for you. I mean, I made mapping Creative Commons, gosh, when was this? 15 years ago. I come from a big open source background because I found it useful for running my business, and I hoped it would be useful for others. So I was set a task for this presentation, which was like to use mapping for looking at the coronavirus and the future of events. And that's a tough one, and so that's where we're going to try and get to. I mean, I've been doing a whole bunch of stuff with various security summits and other bits and pieces, looking at coronavirus and other aspects of change. I am working with a whole bunch of research groups at the moment on looking at points of change. So let's get started. Just a quick apology if you hear any noise in the background. It's because I'm at home and my family's learning to play the piano, and so you might occasionally every now and then hear the tinkle of notes and things like that. I hope you don't mind. Now I've got, well, if you do mind, I'm sorry. I'm not going to do anything about it. So I'm going to get started by sharing some slides. Let me just check. Hang on, make sure everybody can enter full screen mode. There we are. Can you see mapping the future of events? Yes? All looking good? Right, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to start off talking about the issue of strategy, and then I'm going to talk about situational awareness, which is how we get to maps and why maps matter. And it's important to start in that space to get an understanding of what maps are. Now, mapping is a huge field, massive field. So I'm going to give you some examples, tracked by context, and then we'll talk about patterns. And then I'm going to talk about practices like Agile and why it doesn't work everywhere, things like that. And then finally, once we've got all those components together, we can talk about the future of events, what's going to happen, and we can have a discussion around that space. I hope that makes sense. And we've got an hour to go. I've got clocks over here telling me, so we better get started. So for me, this journey started here. This is a particular company called Fatango. It was an online photo service. I had about 16 different lines of business, very successful, revenue growing, profitable, all that sort of stuff, but it had a huge problem. And the huge problem was the CEO, the person in charge. You see, our CEO was what we call a fake CEO. They were making it up as they went along. They didn't have a clue what they were doing. Now, I know this because I was the CEO. So there I was in charge of this company. We're still, revenue growing, all the rest of it. Haven't got a clue what I'm doing. I'm starting to worry that people would eventually rumble that I'm making it up. So we used to have vision statements and strategy statements. This is us in 2003. Our strategy is customer focused. We will lead an innovative effort in the market through our use of agile techniques and open source, blah. The problem is I pinched this from another company and literally just changed a few words. And I was, oh God, there must be more to it than just thieving somebody else's and changing a few words. So I started going around recording other CEOs talking about strategy. And I used to listen to the words they would use. I would record what I called the common words, or business level abstractions about healthy strategy, as I called them, or BLAS for short. And I used to produce these table of BLAS every couple of years. So this was about 2013, 2014. Common BLAS at the time were digital business, big data, disruptive, innovative, collaborative, competitive advantage, ecosystem, blah, blah, blah. If I did it today, you'd probably hear, I don't know, machine learning, blockchain, AI, all that sort of stuff as well. Anyway, so what I then did was I took the strategy documents for, I've done this for many, many years. I took the strategy documents for many companies and came up with what I called the BLA template. So our strategy is BLA. We will lead a BLA effort of the market through our use of BLA and BLA to build a BLA. And I built this by literally combining these strategy vision statements together. And then I just ran the BLAs and the BLA templates together and auto-generated at random 64 strategies. And I've done this many times. So this was from, oh gosh, about 2014, this particular one. So here's a random example. Just by randomly inserting the words into the template, our strategy is innovative digital business. We will lead a growth effort of the market through our use of customer-focused competitive advantage and disruptive social media to build a collaborative revolution. Sounds almost realistic. And so I sent these around. And in this particular case, 2014, I got about 400 responses of 3 basic types. The first was, this is the exact wording from our business plan. The second was, I've seen 2 of these used already. And the third, and my favorite, was, are you for hire? Now, a friend of mine has put this all online. This is strategy as a service. So that's the URL at the bottom. So if you ever need a strategy, you just type in the URL. It will automatically generate you one based upon nothing whatsoever. So, you know, our strategy is collaborative. We will lead an open. It's just smashing the BLAs and the BLA template together. If you want to, you can believe there's machine learning and blockchain or whatever else, big data behind it, if you really must. And if you don't like it, it's really simple. You just press refresh and it creates you a new one. And so that's it. I came to the sort of conclusion that I wasn't the only person making it all up as it went along. But I didn't stop there. I actually went to, I was in a bookstore actually. And the bookseller said, have you ever read The Art of War by Sun Tzu? And I went, because I was asking about strategy books. And I went, no. And so they persuaded me to buy 2 copies, being a good bookseller, 2 different translations. And it was in reading the translations that I noticed something. So when Sun Tzu talked about competition, he talked about 5 factors that mattered. Have a purpose, a moral imperative. 2, understand your landscape, the environment you're competing in. 3, understand how the landscape is changing, the climatic patterns impacting it. 4, understand doctrine, principles of organization. And finally, you get into the whole leadership, the gameplay, the exciting strategy stuff. Then I came across John Boyd. Now, John Boyd was a US Air Force pilot. He didn't actually write a book himself, others wrote books about him, but he came up with the OODA loop. So what you've got is the game, your purpose. The first thing is you observe the environment. That's the first O of OODA. So that's what landscape and climatic patterns are about. And then you orientate yourself around this. That's what principles are around. And then you decide where you're going to act, and then you act, and it's a cycle. And the more you go around the cycle, the better you get at the game. Now, at the very heart of the cycle are 2 whys. There's the why of purpose, my moral imperative, and the why of movement. Do I move this piece or that piece? And they're very, very different whys, but they're at the heart. So when people say strategy is all about the why, you know, well, fair enough, but there are 2 whys and you've got to answer both. So think of it like a game of chess. The why of purpose might be to win the game. The why of movement is, do I move piece A or piece B? And it's through movement and action that we actually learn about the environment, as long as we can actually perceive the landscape. And that brought me to the subject of situational awareness. Now, before I go on, because we've only 9 minutes, 10 minutes into the call, do we have any quick questions about that? Please, by the way, add in questions as we go along. Perfectly happy. No? Okay, well, not a problem. I'm just signaling what I will do is I'll take, every time we come to one of these, I'll take a break, and basically, if you've got questions as we go along, fire them in. So there I was, realizing, that my strategy was a mess and that there's something about the landscape was important. And this led me to the issue of situational awareness. Now, I'm going to start off with a story, several stories, before we get into maps. From Herman, head due west towards Half, you will have sailed north of Hatland. This is part of an epic story, a very, very long story, which actually Vikings used to use to navigate. That's my example of a frightening person of Viking in the background. That story, the entire epic, roughly translates into this. Okay, so the question I had to ask is, what would you use to navigate? Would you use some sort of visual map, or would you use some sort of verbal story? Now, if I'm trying to give somebody directions to a shop down the road, I might use some verbal story, if it's close proximity. But if I'm doing anything complex, I'm going to tend to use a map. Now, the thing about my business at the time, I noticed that we were heavily reliant upon stories. Now, stories are quite difficult things, and the reason for this is pretty simple. With stories, we have a storyteller. So if I'm the CEO, and this is me as the CEO, Fat Cat, here I am going from Herman, head towards Half, and you will have sailed north. If you challenge that, that tends to make me very angry. And it makes me angry because you are challenging me. Whoops, I'm getting suddenly a bit of echo. It challenges me because I'm actually the storyteller. We spend an awful long time trying to persuade people that good leaders are great storytellers, i.e., the only reason why your story failed is because you're not a good enough storyteller. Therefore, you need to become a better storyteller. And that also means when you challenge a story, you are challenging the storyteller and the person. And that's why stories get highly political. Okay, so this is a Roman city. There's about 35 points of interest, 10 points of security, 10 15 civic buildings, 10 residential areas. If you describe just simple paths from A to B, just simple, not compound A, B, C, and D, just simple A to B, in roughly 25 words for each path, just that number of paths would take you 20,000 words. So there's an awful lot of information condensed in a map, and this doesn't even enable us, doesn't even cover if we start exploring. Now, the point about the stories is very simple. If I give you a verbal story, how to go from A to B, go here, and you challenge it, you are challenging me personally. But if I put that story in a mapping form, you can look at the map and you're not challenging me. You're saying, surely there's another path. Surely we can go that way. And the point about maps is they take that politics away because you're now challenging the map, not the person. Right. So another example of situational awareness and why maps can be useful, game of chess. I want you to imagine you live in a world where everybody plays chess, and how well you play the game determines your success in the world, but you've never seen a chessboard. All you've ever seen are these characters on a screen, and you play the game pretty simply. You press a button, pawn. Your opponent sees what you've pressed, they press a button, pawn. You see what they pressed, you press a button, pawn. And this game goes on and on for ages and very boring until somebody wins, or more likely it's a draw. Now, what will happen is after thousands of these games, we will put these games into our big data systems and discover magic secrets of success. So, for example, if I press, knight, you might respond with pawn, bishop, pawn as the counter move. We'll write books on this. The secret, the queen, the secret of the pawn, whatever it happens to be. Okay. Then what will happen is one day you, as an expert in this, will play a total novice, but the novice will see something magical. They will see the board. So what will happen is you will press a button, pawn, and they will counter. You will see they pressed pawn, and then you counter pawn, and they counter queen, and you've lost. And the first thing you're going to go is, what the fiddlesticks happened there? How did I lose this game? The next thing you're going to do is write down this sequence as some super secret, magic secret of success that has been never discovered before. And of course, when you play it against this player, you will lose again. You're completely oblivious to the fact that there is a board and that they can see it. So now you'll start getting desperate. You'll keep on losing. You'll start going, maybe it's the speed at which they press the buttons. Won't help you. Then you'll start going, maybe it's cultural. Maybe they're a happy sort of person. Won't help you. You lose because you exist in what we call a low-level situational awareness environment. Okay? So the question is, what would you use to learn? Secrets of success or context-specific play? Obviously, context-specific play. But in my business, we were more using secrets of success. Lots of articles like this, top 10 secrets of successful CEOs, or how earlobes can signify. This is a genuine article from our HBR, the importance of earlobes for leadership. So I'll give you a final example. This is Thermopylae. So Themistocles, ancient politician, Greek general, had a problem. The Persians were invading. There are approximately, well, we don't know, 140 to 170,000 Persians, roughly. The Greeks were independent city-states, but they worked together in times of crisis. And so Themistocles was the general and decided to block off the Straits of Artemisium, force the Persians along a coastal road to Thermopylae narrow pass. Small number of troops can defend against the larger force. There's about 140, 170,000 Persians. There are about 4,000 Greeks, including 300 Spartans. And that's where we get the story of the 300 from. Now, I want you to imagine it's the eve of battle. I am Themistocles. I'm giving you purpose and moral imperative. We want to defend against the invading Persian horde. And then I say to you, I don't understand the landscape. I don't understand the environment. I have no map, but have no fear, for I have produced a SWOT diagram. Strengths: a well-trained Spartan army, a high level of motivation not to become a Persian slave. Weaknesses: the ephors might stop the Spartans turning up. A truckload of Persians are turning up. Opportunities: get rid of the Persians, get rid of the Spartans. We're Athenian, we actually hate the Spartans. And the threats: the Persians get rid of us. And the oracle says a really dodgy film might be produced in a few thousand years later. So that leads to the question, what would you use to communicate and determine strategy in battle? Position and movement described by a map, or some magic framework like a SWOT diagram? Oh, it's obvious. Position and movement described by a map. But in my business, we were using magic frameworks, SWOTs. So we were using stories, and we were using secrets of success, and top 10 successful tips of CEOs or whatever, and we're using magic frameworks like SWOTs. And we didn't have any maps. And that's the bit which made me realize this is why everything felt so fake, because I'm competing in a landscape that I cannot see. Which brings me to the issue of maps. Before I go, any questions on that? Just give me a thumbs up if we're good to go. One question? No? I'm going to go straight on then. All right, so let's... Oh, hello. Oh, good. Right, I'm going to go straight on into maps then. So before I can explain what is a map, I better explain what is not a map. So the three diagrams at the top, Nottingham, London, Dover, these are places in the United Kingdom. Nottingham, London, Dover, Nottingham, London, Dover are all identical because they're graphs. The three diagrams at the bottom are all completely different because they're maps. The difference between a graph and a map is in a map, space has meaning. So if you take a map and you move a component, like you take an atlas of the world and you move Australia and you put it, I don't know, next to, well, I live in the UK, so put it next to the UK, that changes the meaning of the map. Okay? So that's a key difference. And because space has meaning, it also means we can go and explore the space. Fairly obvious. Now, what I had in my business was lots of systems maps. I had systems maps, business process maps, mind maps, all sorts of wonderful maps. But if I took a systems map like this, and I take a component CRM, customer relationship management, and I move it, Does the meaning of the map change? And the answer is no. But if I move Australia, the meaning of the map changes. Yes, well, it doesn't change here because it's not a map. Unfortunately, every single thing in business that I had, which was called a map, had one thing in common. None of them were actually maps. They're all graphs. I'm afraid we keep on using that word in business, and it doesn't mean what we think it means. Maps are very specific and precise things. So in order to be a map, space has got to have meaning. So you've got to have an anchor, point of reference, magnetic north. You've got to have position of pieces relative to the anchor. This is north, south, east, or west of this. And this is, you've got to have consistency of movement. As in, I'm heading north, it means I'm heading north. Okay? So a simple example, I'll start with a cup of tea. Because being a Brit, I like tea shops. So first of all, we need a point of reference. So what I do is I use users as points of reference. And those users could be public consumers, it could be the business itself, it could be government regulators. Right, in the case of a tea shop, the public, we'll say, has a need for cups of tea, and the business has a need to sell cups of tea. So our two anchors at the top are the business and public. Of course, you know, there's also regulators involved, but we'll keep it simple. Now, a cup of tea itself has needs. It needs tea, a cup, hot water, water, kettle, and power. There are many components that you need to make a cup of tea. So what I've now got is an anchor at the top and position described through a chain of needs. So to the public, the cup of tea is more visible to them than the power that you use to power the kettle to heat the water to make the cup of tea. Okay, that's much further removed. Now I've got anchor and position, but I haven't got movement. Turns out that all forms of capital evolve through a common process. So you start off with the genesis of novel and new stuff, custom built examples, products and rental services, commodity and utility services. So now I've got anchor, position and movement, and that is a map. And the point about this is somebody can then look at it and say, oh, you're missing things like staff. Somebody can say, oh, actually staff should be robots. And of course, these are diagrams of capital. So the stocks, each of the nodes are stocks of capital, each of the lines are flows of capital. So you can use this to create things like P&Ls. And then I might go, why is the kettle custom built? Surely the kettle is more of a commodity. And then somebody else will come along, oh, it has to be special because of brand exclusivity for whatever reason. But now, at least, because we've also got the financial figures, we can work out what that brand exclusivity costs. But the best part about this is it doesn't matter whether you're from finance operations or whether you're from engineering or marketing or whatever, or sales, we can all talk about the same landscape using a map. Almost inconceivable. Well, that's what happened to me. So I started off with systems diagrams and converting them to maps. And this was an example map from 2005. And it changed our entire discussions in the organization. Got rid of those arguments. We're now talking about the maps themselves and how the components are evolving. Okay. So that leads me on to track by context, as I just want to show you just a couple of simple things. This is an insurance company. It's the process flow. They order compute, they need compute, they order server, server goes into goods in, modify, mount, and rack it. They've got a bottleneck in their process flow. So they spent 6 months working out how to get rid of it with robotics. They're going to invest in robotics, big digital transformation program. Okay. Millions, many millions about to be spent. Now, the thing is, you can't go in and say, why are you using robots? They'd look at your big angry story, etc., fight, you know, you're challenging our story. So I got them to map it. Very simple map. User needs compute. They put compute in product. I disagree, but fair enough. They go order server, server goods in, and they put rack, mount, modify. It literally took them 15 minutes to produce this map. And I was able to look at it and say, why have you got rack and custom built? And they come back to me and say, well, because we have custom built racks. We have a company that make them. So what are the modifications you're making to your servers? Well, they don't fit our racks. So we have to take cases off, drill new holes, add new plates to get them to fit our racks. That's why you need robotics, yes. And of course, at that moment, everybody's looking at each other going, hang on, this sounds daft. Why are we doing this? Why aren't we using standard racks? But the point about this is they're not daft. They were simply trapped by context, trapped by their pre-existing environment. And it's very, very common. So what's happening is people are concentrating on improving process flow, when in fact they should be concentrating on evolutionary flow. The issue is not you need robotics. The issue is custom built racks made sense at a point in time, but that is long gone, and that needs to change. Once you do that, you may as well say, well, compute, that's not really a product, it's a utility, that's the process flow we need. Another example, weighing machines, government agency. Very simple. Big digital program, introduce weighing machines. So to describe the problem, this agency has to report a count, and that count is the number of paper forms that are filled in by people. And it turns out it's cheaper to weigh paper forms in mass to work out the number than it is to actually physically count them up. So they have big weighing machines to weigh paper forms. And what they wanted, digital transformation effort to make better weighing machines, as in connected to the system. So that's the start of the map. And I asked them, where do the paper forms come from? They come from goods in. Go to goods in, where do you get paper forms from? Distribution sites all over the country. You ask a distribution site, they've got printing facilities because they're printing them out because the users are actually filling online systems in. So the users are filling systems online, which the distribution sites are then printing out in order to send the paper forms to this other group, which then weighs the paper forms to work out how many users filled in the system, which they did online. It made sense at some point in time, but the problem is the paper forms have become electronic records. Okay, so all of this stuff can be replaced by select count start from table. And what's happening is, again, people optimizing process flow when really they should be focused on evolutionary flow. Okay, so that's the basics of maps, fundamentally communication tool. Good. Any questions? No, because I'm going to get straight on into patterns.
We have a couple of questions.
Sure.
Jonas was asking about the flows of capital. Is that a requirement constraint for a map has? It should somehow reflect the flow of goods on capital.
Okay, so just quickly answer that. I actually map cultural systems, legal systems. So you can map anything which is basically where you have either an activity, practice, data, or some concept or knowledge, which is in competition between others. Because fundamentally, the evolution curve, the evolution axis at the bottom is driven by competition. You'll notice my maps don't have a value chain on the left because that's purely artificial. That was purely put in there as for training to get people started. So if you ever see value chain on the left, it's just to help people get going. So anything in competition, which can evolve through competition, as far as I'm aware, you can map.
Okay.
Okay.
There's another question, which is from Claudio Perrone, which is, are there landscapes where the maps are changing all the time? And his guess is yes. Well, I guess it's a matter of frequency, but...
So the easy thing with geography, when mapping geography, and the best thing about it is that if I go on a journey from, say, Thebes to Athens or whatever, then during the journey, it's unlikely that Athens will have moved. So over a long period of time, places do move. So Pangaea was 200 million years ago, so the continents do move, but it's pretty slow. Unfortunately, in the world of business, things moving or things evolving. So, you know, it used to be quite slow. Nuts and bolts took 2,000 years before we went from nuts and bolts to Whitworth standards, electricity 1400, computing 60 years to go from sort of like Genesis to more commodity. So yes, unfortunately, in our lifetime, the thing is likely to have moved. And that's why mapping is a little bit more difficult, because you have to map in terms of change itself. Now, I want to make sure we get through the whole lot. So those are two good questions. I'm now going to move on to the next bit. Because if you've got the basics of maps and, you know, anchor, position and movement, the first thing you learn are patterns. And there's three basic types of patterns. Climatic patterns, doctrine, and leadership and gameplay. I'm not going to mention leadership and gameplay because it's way too complex. So I'm just going to stick with the simple climatic and doctrine. So we start with climatic patterns. These are the rules that influence the game. They're very simple things. Like when you have a map and you look at a map, it's not static. All those components will evolve if there is competition. So everything will move from left to right. If there's supply and demand competition, it will move. Doesn't matter whether it's an activity or a practice, data, or even a concept of knowledge. Now, as it evolves, we have inertia to that change because of pre-existing practices and past success, basically. So that's another pattern that you notice. Everything evolves and we have inertia. My classic example of this is just Blockbuster Netflix. If you look at who was first with a website, who was first with video ordering online, who was first with experimenting with video streaming, you'll discover it was all Blockbuster. And then who went bankrupt first? That was also Blockbuster. Blockbuster wasn't some dinosaur. They out-innovated most people. The problem is their past success, late fees. That was how they made a lot of money. That created inertia to change. Okay. So things evolve, and then you notice another pattern. Efficiency enables innovation. So as things evolve, they enable higher order systems to appear. Oops. And that's known as, so like electricity becoming, Parthian battery, Hippolyte Pixel, Siemens generators, eventually Tesla Westinghouse utility provision, that enables the appearance of higher order systems. Electricity enables lighting, computing, radio. Okay, and that's a simple effect known as componentization from Herbert Simon's theory of hierarchy. Can I just check, can you see the screen okay? Yeah, good, right, super duper. Now, those higher order systems we call the adjacent unexplored, as in, when electricity was a utility, we created all sorts of wonderful things like refrigeration blankets. We had no idea what would succeed or not. Somebody had this crazy idea for a box with moving pictures in it. Oh, that's never going to work. Turns out that was the TV industry. So the adjacent unexplored, we can build it more quickly. We just don't know what's going to be successful. So here be dragons, is the way we say it. Now, those higher order systems, as well as being unknown, create new sources of value or worth, and they will now evolve if there is supply and demand competition. Now, all of this stuff can be used in anticipation of change. So very simply, you have a map, you start to apply common economic patterns to it. There's 30 of these. I've mentioned a handful. Most people are oblivious to all of this stuff. So back in 2005, there was my value chain of one of the lines of business of for Tango. We knew that compute and runtime would tend to be utility. We knew we'd have inertia to the change. We knew it would enable higher order systems to appear. So this gave us multiple points that we could invest. So now we have to decide, do we invest in this space or that space or this space or that space? One of the things maps won't do is they won't give you the answer. They show you a landscape. Then you have to apply thought to it. But at least we now could see where might be useful areas to grab. So that's what we did. We built the first serverless environment, JavaScript front and back end, billing per function, build entire applications online. That was called Zimkey. Amazon EC2 launched next year, and so we quickly migrated it onto that, and we had people building entire applications. It was marvelous, fabulous. Unfortunately, despite its glowing success and some rave fans and all the rest of it, a big parent company had a very expensive management consultancy firm basically say the stuff we were doing, 3D printing, mobile phones, cameras, cloud, was not the future. The future was television, 3D TVs, LCDs. So they shut us all down, spent, I think it was about $1 billion, huge amounts on in the TV era. Oh well. So I went to work for a friend of mine, Mark, at a place called Canonical, provides an operating system called Ubuntu. 2008, we simply mapped out the space, looked at how compute was going to evolve, used the maps to work out where we needed to attack. We knew that there would be some new practices appear. It's one of the patterns you learn. It's called coevolution. And so we use that to target the market. It literally cost me about, I think it was $500,000. It was 18 months. And we were 2 to 3% of the operating system market. And by the end of it, we'd taken 70% of all cloud computing. If you were around in cloud at the time, you might have remembered it was all Red Hat, Microsoft, and then suddenly everything was all Ubuntu. Well, you were mapped. Okay, and then after that, I started using it in government. So created something called the Better for Less paper with people like Liam Maxwell, Jerry Fishington, and others, Mark Thompson. Many of the concepts of mapping are in this. That led to things like spend control and helped in the formation of something called government digital services. Right, so now I'm going to talk about Agile. And the reason why I'm going to talk about Agile is I want to introduce doctrine as well. So doctrine, what is doctrine? Oops. Right. Doctrine are universally applicable principles regardless of context. So what I mean by that is some patterns, are climatic, as in they're the rules of the game. You can't manipulate those, they just change the environment. As things evolve, they enable higher order systems to appear. Other patterns you get to choose whether to use or not. The ones that are universally useful are called doctrine. The ones that are context specific are called gameplay. So these are the doctrine ones, universally useful. So as things evolve, they become more efficient and they enable higher order systems to appear, which create new sources of value and worth, which then evolve. Okay, basic climactic patterns. Now, as they evolve, their characteristics change. It doesn't matter whether it's money, computing, penicillin, whatever it is. Starts off in this uncharted space, the EB dragons, chaotic, uncertain, unpredictable, exciting, and different. The same thing evolves, and over time, it becomes more industrialized, ordered, standard, stable, dull, boring, whatever. And of course, that enables new higher order systems to appear, which then evolve. Now, because of this, there's no such thing as one-size-fits-all methodology. Something like extreme programming is very good on the left-hand side because it's good at reducing the cost of change, and change is undesirable. Whereas Six Sigma is good on the right-hand side because it's good at reducing deviation, and deviation is not what you want. And Lean, so Scrum, MVP, plus other artifacts are good in the middle because it's all about learning and reducing waste. Unfortunately, whenever you say that at a conference, doesn't matter which one you go to an Agile conference and say Agile is not suitable everywhere, or go to a Lean conference and say Lean's not suitable everywhere, or a Six Sigma, and they'll always respond, burn him heretic. It's the same with purchasing. No such thing as one size fits all. Time, material-based, outcome-based, COTS, unit, utility. You need multiple methods as things evolve. So to give you an example, HS2, high-speed rail. This is James Finley, a friend of mine, former CIO, now does stuff with the Royal Navy and the lifeboats, etc. Very exciting stuff. Anyway, HS2, they decided to build the entire railway in a virtual world. That's the systems diagram of the entire railway in a virtual world. So how do I manage it? That was James's question. Do I outsource it? Do I use off-the-shelf products? Do I build in-house? Maybe I do some sort of combination. Well, the problem is there's 380 million permutations with that question alone of this simple diagram. So what he decided to do was to draw a map. There's the map, send it to me. It's a paper diagram. It only took a few minutes. Well, it took him about half an hour on a Sunday lunchtime. That's what it became. This is 2012, and now it's quite easy. Outsource the stuff on the right-hand side, off-the-shelf products in the middle, agile in-house on the left. Multiple methods all at the same time. Now, vendors tend to hate this. And they tend to hate this for a simple reason. They want you to outsource the whole lot. And they want you to outsource the whole lot because you'll write a contract. And you're in the contract, you want to know what's being delivered. And the stuff on the right will be efficiently delivered because you can specify. And the stuff on the left will invariably incur excessive change control costs because you can never specify. Never. Which is why all these outsourcing projects are, on large scale. If you haven't mapped it, doomed to failure. You'll always cost overrun. And of course, the worst thing is somebody on your side will say this: next time we need to specify it better. So in the case of HS2, for the building the entire railway in a virtual world, they mapped it out. They used that, and they ended up in the Public Accounts Committee being praised. They're ahead of schedule and under budget. Fantastic. Right, so I'm going to give you an example for you to do. I'm going to give you a self-driving car, and I'm going to pretend you're not in IT, you're in finance. So I've translated the entire systems diagram into Elvish. There you are. Systems diagram in Elvish. So now I'm going to ask you questions. Should I outsource build our own A? Should I outsource build our own B? What do you think? I'm trying to collaborate. I'm trying to work with you. And the answer is, you shouldn't have a clue. And now if I turn it into a mapping form, it's easy. Should I outsource A? Yes. Should I build our own B? Yes. And that's the simple difference between a map. And that simple difference can be hundreds of millions. Okay. At which point, normally somebody says to me, Agile will evolve to be everywhere. Well, social practice theory, Elizabeth showed, just very quick. As practices evolve, because it's not just activities, but practices evolve, Agile has evolved to become, well, when we talk about practices, we normally use novel, emerging, good, and best. Agile has evolved to become good practice for building a new thing. But that new thing, doesn't matter what it is, teleportation, kit and internet, don't really care, it will evolve itself. And Lean has evolved to become good to best practice for stuff in the middle. And Six Sigma has evolved to become best practice for stuff in the more industrialized form. So here's the problem. You've got 3 different competencies, all with the same meaning of project management. Okay, all of those are different competencies, but they all mean project management. And you've got one common meaning, the thing, teleportation, whatever, but you've got 3 different material instances. And one competency is good for one material instance. And what we keep on doing, and it's a terrible mistake, is we try and take one and make it suitable everywhere by co-opting everything, which is why Agile is becoming unagile at the moment, okay? Because invariably you'll fail and then people will start blaming you for using the wrong bits. So use appropriate methods. And that's an example of doctrine. So doctrine, very simple. I've gone through a whole bunch in this discussion. I've just hidden them. First one, focus on user needs. Understand the details. Think small, break things into small components. Use appropriate methods. Challenge assumptions. Why are we using custom-built kettles or custom-built racks? There's about 40 of them. And the ones I've mentioned are in what we call phase 1. They're the easiest ones that you should do. Challenge assumptions, understand what is being considered, know your users, focus on user needs. Anyway, there's 40 of them. In the same way, there's 30 common economic patterns, okay? Now, to give you an idea, this is a web engineering giant. Blue is good. They're pretty good at most of this stuff, a couple of areas they're weak at. This is a typical bank, financial services company, pretty dreadful, the whole lot. But it's okay to be useless as long as everybody you're competing against is also useless as well. Then no one gains an advantage. All right. At which point people normally say to me, oh, we just need an agile culture. Okay. First of all, this is Krober. Despite a century effort to adequately define culture, there is no agreement among anthropologists. Basically, anthropologists have been trying to define what culture is for over 100 years and have so far not agreed. Okay. One of my favorite is Margaret Mead. And Margaret Mead talked about how language is a discipline of cultural behavior. And that's a problem. That's a problem because of what Kurt Gödel said. Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem. You cannot, a system cannot be within itself contain a complete and true definition of itself, i.e., if language is part of culture, we will not be able to describe culture fully using language alone. Now, that gave me an idea of using a map. So when I talk about the axis at the bottom, Genesis, custom, product, commodity, as I said, you can map practices, data, knowledge. We just have different labels. There's a whole long piece of work about the analysis of this stuff, but we just have different labels. And I can pick any of those labels. So I can go concept, emerging, convergent, accepted. And I can put that at the bottom of a map. Concept, emerging, converging, accepted. It's the same characteristics, just different labels. So now I can start mapping things like legal systems and ethical values. Reciprocity, fairness, abolition of slavery is connected to workers' rights and civil rights. Martin Luther King, the twin pillars of democracy, and the things above that are connected to those ideas. Now, normally, when we've got a pipeline of rights or pipeline of things, we just give it a word like values and use a square to denote that actually it's not a single piece of capital, it's an entire pipeline of capital. And so using that approach, you can actually map culture. There you are. This is a map, a representation of what culture is. It's very imperfect, like all maps. It's wrong, like all maps. It's just waiting for somebody to create a better map. But it starts at the very top with two focuses, me and we. The we is all about the collective. It has behavior and values, enablement, doctrine, principles, memory, rituals. Oh, it's exciting. Lots of good stuff. But it's wrong. But it's a representation of culture, which you couldn't actually describe in less than 20,000 words. And what you discover is no such thing as a single culture. You can't just copy somebody's culture. You can't even just say, oh, we'll just copy your values and your structure. We'll be like Spotify, because there's so many other components involved in making that culture happen. But you can adopt bits. You can take doctrine and adopt them according to your landscape. And there's feedback loops in here as well. You know, a sense of belonging in a collective. Behavior reinforces safety, encourages a sense of belonging. And you're constrained, like the gameplay you can use in a company or an organization depends upon the memory of the organization, the values that the organization has. So you have to think carefully about acting. So in the UK, we had Dominic Cumming going and doing his, I've got to go and get my eyesight tested by going to Barnard Castle or whatever it was. And so you know, that sort of individual behavior and the values they represent, you know, that can become lodged in memory, and that can affect you in very bad ways because it can limit and constrain your gameplay. Or, you know, your values might be seen to fail, your collective seen to fail. And that can undermine the safety within the group. That's another loop that exists. Anyway, all maps, imperfect representations. So I'm confused. What should we do? Well, the simple thing to do is forget culture and organization, just focus on situational awareness, understand how to map and learn those basics of doctrine. So recap, talked about strategy, went on to situational awareness, went on to maps, talked about track by context, went on to patterns, talked about agile, and as an example of doctrine. It's very simple. It all stems from this cycle. Okay, understand your purpose, and then understand the landscape, how it's changing, learn to apply patterns of organization structure around it, and decide where you're going to attack, and you act. And the more you go around this loop, the better you get, assuming you can perceive the environment. And that is what a map is for. Now, on to the special subject. Since I mentioned the whole sort of culture map and Mr. Cummings, I suppose it is time to talk about COVID, forcing functions, why now, and what the impact is going to be. And I can do this now because I've shown you all these patterns and all these basics of maps. So I can talk in a language which hopefully you'll be able to understand. So if I take any value chain, user, application, best coding practice, runtime, operating system, best architectural practice, compute, every component is evolving. And one of the most interesting changes is when any component shifts from that stage 3 of product to stage 4 of commodity utility. And why it's interesting is because it causes an explosion of higher order systems, a new emerging practice, which is why with cloud we saw things like DevOps. So you get this new emerging practice because we shift from, well, cloud, we shifted from what's known as a high mean time to recovery, high MTTR, to a low MTTR environment. So you get this new emerging practice and these new needs. So you get things like Netflix, etc. Okay. This happens throughout history. Every time we have a major, what we call revolution, it's always about industrialization of some underlying components. Age of electricity. It wasn't the discovery of electricity. That was long, long before that. It was all about industrialization to a utility. Okay. Now, we have inertia to that change because of pre-existing practice. which is why, in the cloud, people who built big data centers had inertia of the change. Fair enough. And of course, once we make the change, then we see flows of capital from the past to the new world. Those are the blue lines. So what happens is the past world gets stuck behind inertia barriers. It basically disappears, and the new world reforms. All the capital flows into it in terms of not only the more utility form, but also the new emerging practice. So that's basically a very simple pattern that reoccurs throughout history. Now, in order to make the jump, you need a number of factors in place: concept, suitability, technology, and attitude. I.e., like with cloud, you needed the concept of utility computing. You needed suitable, widespread, well-defined enough. You needed the technology. You needed attitude, people willing to give up on the past and create the new. Now, interestingly, often those exist, and the act exists long before people start adopting. But some other factor comes into place, some sort of forcing need to make the change happen. So this is New York City. This is turn of the 20th century, 1900s. If you look up and down on the side of the streets, you see big piles. That's horse manure. The city was being buried in horse manure because of so many horses. They used to have public meetings to talk about the problem of horse manure. This is why the motor car was so rapidly adopted and transformed parts of the whole US economy. So why my interest in this? So we give this cycle a name, actually. I call it the Peace, War, and Wonder cycle. It's the same as the adaptive renewal cycle, C.S. Hollings' work. So you get the wonder of new things, a state of peaceful competition, and big giants build up, are still fierce. They have inertia to change, and then new entrants come in, industrialize the space, and that causes an explosion of higher order systems, change of practice. We call that the war. So like it was a bookseller who industrialized compute, not a compute vendor, because everybody else had inertia. And in the software world, that's going right up and down the stack. So it's going on with the runtime at the moment. That's why you hear lots of people talking about serverless and Lambda, because you're getting a new set of emerging practice, and everything else is just the past world. Okay, and this is perfectly normal. Every time we go through any of these changes, we get that new practice. We also get a new form of organization appear. Commercial farmer markets, American system of engineering, scientific management, perfectly normal. So I knew this in 2011. So when I was researching into the subject, because of the whole cloud war, as in the shift from product to utility of compute, we knew we'd get an emerging practice. And we knew what some of those things were. And so I was able to go and do a population study. And this is what it looked like. This is the results back in 2011. Traditional next generation companies. Structure, departmental service cell-based. Culture, inertia, fluid gameable. Corporate focus, profit disruption, learning, analyst ecosystems. Perfectly normal change. New form of organization. And over time, organizations have become more and more like that next generation. Okay. And for me, all of those characteristics end up in that doctrine table, which you saw earlier. So this table here. Every time we go through these changes, it updates the doctrine. And that's actually useful for me for mergers and acquisition. And that's why I'm interested. So why now? Well, specifically, well, it's not why now, it's why in 2014. So in 2014, using a map, because it all comes from text analysis, I wanted to identify when these points of war were likely to occur. And I did a piece of work which was all about frequency changes of publication types. And I won't go through it other than it's a weak signal. And what I mean by weak signal, it's a way of identifying things that potentially may happen. So this is what I published in 2014. Between 2020 and 2030, we should see robotics, sensor as a service, IoT, immersive tech, 3D printing, and a whole bunch of other things start to industrialize. And every time they do, you cause an explosion of higher order systems, new practices, which is why I organized a study tour to go and visit all of these companies. I take a whole bunch of execs to go and visit these companies. including space and robotics and 3D printing and sensors, brain scanning sensors. And of course, what happened is we had the forcing function. And that's really what COVID is doing in the isolation economy. It's acting as a forcing function. Because even like events like this, the first virtual event I gave was in 2006. That was 14 years ago. And why haven't we started doing more virtual events? Well, because we've come up for reasons why we had to meet in person. And COVID is actually acting as a forcing function, as in it is shifting that sort of behavior. So let's look at the impact. Why are events going virtual? Well, we've been able to shift. If we think about users, events, and the physical space, we've been able to shift it to virtual space for a long, long time. And we have known that it would create new practices and new sorts of opportunities. But we've resisted because of social interaction, because the desire to meet people and all those sorts of things. Well, the isolation economy is just acting as a forcing function. It's pushing us to adopt technologies which actually already existed. You hear about it, doesn't matter whether I'm talking defense or healthcare or robotic or sensors, the stuff that is rapidly changing was already pre-existing. It's just there was inertia, resistance to it and so forth. And now what's happening is this has just accelerated that adoption. And as a result, it's starting to create those new emerging practices and those new needs. So if you're a business built around events and physical spaces, that's a problem. Many businesses are sitting there hoping that after the pandemic, we'll just go back to exactly how things were. But the reality is, well, with the forcing function, it's not a case of, New York City, we need to get rid of the horse manure. We all adopt cars. Once we've all adopted cars, there isn't horse manure. So let's go back to horses. No, the industry changes. We have to adapt. So the smart money out there seems to be focused on how do we recreate those social interactions in the virtual space? How do we build those new needs, those new ways, those new emerging practices based upon events which we don't physically meet up? Is it a permanent thing? Once you start to get these new emerging practices, new needs start to appear, they tend to cement the underlying change. Okay. So quick recap. I started about strategy, situational awareness, maps, got you to the basic of a map, then talked about how you're being tracked by context and the idea of patterns, the different types of patterns, and gave an example in Agile and the importance of doctrine. And once we got all that, then I could start to explore that entire area of COVID. At the heart of this all is very simple. It's that diagram. Have a purpose, understand your landscape, understand how the landscape is changing, orientate yourself around it with doctrine, decide where you're going to act, and it's a cycle. The more you go around this, the better you get, as long as you can perceive the environment. In order to perceive the environment, you need some form of map. At that point, somebody usually says, what about strategy? And I say, don't worry. They normally say, heretic Burnham. 3 subjects you do not want to worry about generally are strategy, culture, and organizational design. I mean, they're all very, very complex. Start with the basics. Understand your situational awareness, as in understand the landscape, and do the basics of principles and doctrine first. Leave those other subjects to a later date. And that's it. Thank you. I can't hear a word anybody's saying, so if you're speaking to me, I don't know.
Nope,
are you all in shock? Oh, what's that?
No, that was for me. Read on Zoom chat.
Oh, okay.
And I guess maybe not only for me, but Zoom chat. Okay, that's a lot. And so
I'll tell you what. I've got a map here. And I've got I've carefully, you see, I left a map at the very end, and hopefully annotate. Go on, then you're going to let me annotate. Oh, look, I've got a pen as well. It works. So if we need to do some mapping, more than happy.
So,
Yes.
No, actually, I think the questions are more on the YouTube.
Okay.
So there was a question that was, is one source of inertia for you to reach massive adoption of mapping? So it seems incredibly useful as a tool. I love it. That was Jonas saying. I love it too. But it's complex and many people struggle to grasp it. Or
Okay.
same guy. Are there any industry or sectors which are adopting it faster than other sectors?
Okay. So there's two questions there. So the first question, I do actually have a map of mapping. I don't have it with me in this presentation pack, but it's online. So, is there inertia to change? Of course, there's always going to be inertia to changing some sort of pre-existing practice. I mean, does it take time? Is it complex? Yes, it takes time. Is it useful? People who use it seem to find it useful. In terms of, does it tell you what to do? No, it just shows you a landscape and a very imperfect representation of a landscape. So unfortunately, if you're looking for an answer, it won't give you that. It just helps you look at the landscape to which you then apply thought to work out what you're going to do. But it's also challenging in a way that maps themselves, because of the patterns, there's about 30 different common economic patterns, 40 different forms of doctrine, over 100 different forms of gameplay. And it's quite funny because when I'm talking to somebody who actually works in the field of strategy and I say, well, have you got a map of your environment? And they say they don't. I'm always wondering, well, what is your strategy based upon? And if it's not based upon an understanding of the landscape and an understanding of reoccurring patterns, what is it built upon? And the reality is most strategy is built on stories and SWOTs and magic thinking and magic frameworks and all that sort of stuff. So it can be quite challenging in that I've seen maps used to completely undermine corporate strategies, company strategies, and get people to change. And if you're from a world of storytelling and you've got your story, and it can be quite, the process of democratizing strategy can be quite demoralizing for some who like to control it through stories. So I've often seen those sorts of scraps as well, I'm afraid. In terms of some industries adopting more, well, the thing is, I started mapping in 2005, and I assumed everybody else in the world was mapping. And it was just that I hadn't done an MBA, and so I had to create my own way of doing it. And it wasn't until 2011 when I was in government, because I talked about it various places, but I was rather embarrassed, as in it's Simon's cheap and cheerful way of mapping. Obviously, you learn the good stuff in the MBAs. I was in government, we had a problem. I quickly mapped it out, and people kept on saying to me, "What's that?" It was actually Liam Maxwell. And I said, "Well, it's a map." And he's a friend of mine I've known for some time. And he said, "Well, I've never seen that before." And it's like, really? But other friends, James Duncan and so forth, we worked on it back in 2005. So what I realized is I started talking to more people and discovered they didn't know what a map was. And then I realized that people weren't mapping. And these days, there's a chap who teaches over at Harvard Kennedy. There's I'm doing a day at LSE. It's been taught at places like Judge Business School. Mark Thompson, he's now at Exeter doing that. And there's other universities, and even over to the Moscow Institute of Technology. Marcus Guest teaches over there. So it's spread into the academic world, and you've got Rosa and Will at LSE doing academic papers as well. And it's spread in lots of different parts of government, so bits of GDS, a bit of NHS, and food standards and TVLA and other groups. It's spread into the UN. So I know Mark Craddock and others who wrote the UN Statistics Handbook has mapping in there, but it's also spread in the corporate world as well. I mean, I was at Netflix last year or the year before, and I was visiting, and I just happened to be on the day, and they were running their own internal map camp. So Rosalind grabbed me and said, "Come along." And it was like, great. And even to the VC communities. So Prasanna K he runs a VC fund, uses mapping for all his startups. So it's spreading, it's pockets of places, but it's slowly spreading. And we have like a map camp where mappers turn up from all over the world. I mean, it was supposed to be me going to a pub expecting about 5 people to turn up, ended up being 800 people. We had an entire theatre. So fairly crazy, but so it's spreading.
And a few other questions. Well, a question from Denise Cooper.
My worst, Denise. So Denise is open source space. I named Denise for many years. So my background is also heavily in the open source space, which is why everything in mapping is Creative Commons share alike. A lot of it, came from the lessons, etc., built in the open source world, which is usually one of the most advanced places in terms of management techniques. The open source world in China, brilliant stuff. It's all Creative Commons. And Denise, Inner Source, and a whole bunch of other things, is a well-known figure. Delighted that she's listening to my ramblings.
Okay, so the question is, won't meeting in a physical space continue to be an elite thing for some time to come, like Jean-Luc Picard and his physical books?
So that's a really interesting question. So one of the issues that we've got, because I just sort of gave an overview to talk about the fact that a lot of what's going on with the pandemic is we're seeing industrialization of various components, creating new practices, okay? And some of those new practices, of course, they're emerging. We don't know what they will be. But one of the things we've noticed, or I've noticed, is obviously there are certain individuals, there's certain organizations who want us to return the previous model, but there's also certain individuals, some people who seem to have an advantage in the physical space because of either presence or because of being able to read people or whatever. And the virtual world is actually quite democratizing. It really seems to change the dynamics of the discussion. So one particular company went through and listed the people, just internal, so I'm not going to name names, but there seem to be a certain, those people who have an advantage in the physical space want us to get back, whereas another group seem to be are very much happy with the virtual world. So this then brings the idea of status, because one of the issues you have with industrialization is always the loss of status with something. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking about, cars becoming a utility, self-driving cars. We not only need to use cars to get from A to B, we also use them as status symbols. And so if every car is a utility, you don't own the car, the question then becomes, how do you recreate status? And then one way is digital subscription models. So you don't own a car, but you have platinum, gold, silver membership. And if I'm a gold member and you're a platinum member, that means when we're driving along the road, my car will get out of the way to let your car automatically go past. So of course, that's embedding social inequality into the transportation system, and that's a complete nightmare for different reasons. And that's something we looked at in DVLA back in 2014, 2015. But so there is an issue in terms of there is a democratization that seems to be going on. There are certain people who want to return because they're natural advantage in the physical space. And there is the potential for that loss of status related to those advantages in the physical space if this virtual space becomes more cemented because of some emerging practices, new type events and so forth. So I suspect in that space, people will create physical real events, and for the elite. And so I think Denise is spot on with that. I mean, in the same way with the shifting of cars to more of a utility version, people will try to recreate that status in terms of digital subscription or route management. Does that make sense?
Yes, a lot.
Good.
And one more. There are actually a couple of questions about the relationship between your maps and innovators dilemma.
Oh, okay. So let me just show you something to get started. If I draw a point here, and I better use a straight line because I'm terrible at drawing. Right. Okay. Good. And we'll use another circle. So I just draw a circle here, put one there, put one there. Right. Okay. So we've got a thing. We'll call it A, A1, A2, A3, A4, A5, which is going to evolve to some point into a utility. Okay. A4, and we'll put A2 and A3. So it's, I don't know, kitten internet. Somebody invents the idea, genesis of kitten internet. It's an internet which kittens really, really want. And then somebody does custom built examples and then eventually get products. So the first thing is this space here, A2, A3. This is what we call product to product substitution. Okay. So if you think of phones, it's Nokia versus Apple. Now, the problem with this is highly unpredictable. It's all dependent upon individual actors' action. So you have no way of knowing whether Nokia or Apple is going to win. So Christensen came out and said that, you know, Nokia would win. It turned out it was Apple. Not because he's daft or wrong, but because, or was wrong, it's completely unpredictable. So this is product substitution can be a type of disruption which is highly unpredictable. And sorry for my terrible typing. Okay, now this one here, A4, A5, that's a product to utility substitution. So that's things like cloud, compute going from product to utility. Okay, so this one is much more predictable because it doesn't depend on individual actors' actions. This is caused by evolution driving something to over that barrier. It will happen at some point. And what we have are weak signals to give us an idea of when it happens. We know pre-existing players will have inertia. We know it will enable higher order systems to appear, change of practice. So there's an awful lot we can say about it. In fact, the predictability of what is going to happen and roughly when it's going to happen are not bad. Okay, over here, it's very, 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 very low. Often you can say what, but not when, or when, but not what. But in the case of compute shifting from product to utility, or anything shifting from product to utility, we can do a good job, or a pretty good job on both of those. Now that's also called disruption, but its difference is it's highly predictable. So here's your problem. You've got two different forms of disruption. So Christensen used to get into an argument with Lepore, and Lepore would go, well, disruption theory is unpredictable. Christensen said it was predictable. Well, they're both right and both wrong, because there's at least two different forms. One is predictable and one is unpredictable. But you can only see that if you look at context. If you can't see the context, you can't see how things are evolving. There's no way you'll ever tell that. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Good, right. So let's get to your innovator's dilemma question then.
Well, it was about execs to care about mapping to position it as a method against the innovator's dilemma. That's okay. That was yeah.
So there's lots of things that people often ask in terms of mapping. Another one is the typical one after the innovator's dilemma Might be. Could you see all my drawings? Was that okay? Was that coming up?
Yes,
yeah?
I can see it.
Okay, super. So another one that comes up. Let me draw this. Is the idea of people talk about horizons. Okay. So right. Something like that. Right. Okay. So let's take an act, a line of business, and we'll call it something A needs B needs C. Okay. Now this at the moment. Oh, there we are. Is I can never remember what they call the horizon zones. This would be zone 1. Is that right? It's the stuff that we are doing. Okay. And zone 2 would be over here, as in that's the near future. And zone 3 would be potentially the new practices, B or whatever, or new needs or whatever, over here. Okay. Now, that's then. If this has evolved, so there's A to B, so there, to C dash, then zone 1, I'll draw this in blue, is now here. Zone 2 is what this is moving on to. Zone 3 is the far future of this becoming industrialized. The point about this, in a very messy way, is where the zones are depends upon where you are on the map. And the reason why I say that is people often go, is zone 1, like here, and zone 2, is that like the products, and zone 3 is the more industrial, or something along those lines. It's not as simple as that. Horizons all depend upon where you are and where the map is. It's all context specific. Does that make sense? Probably not, in which case I shouldn't have mentioned it. There we are. Just for those interested.
Yeah, well, actually, where the zones are depends on where you are. I think it makes
absolutely
a lot of sense. It's not this is how you map things in an industry. Just think like this is what your dependency, the chain of needs that you're building it upon is for you.
Yeah.
And then okay, let's see how the forces are shifting things in your context.
So another typical example of this is if people use the word emerging. Okay. I do use word emerging, novel, emerging, good and best when talking about practices, but people talk about emerging technology. Okay. Now, this is compute. This is 1943, the Z3. This is, IBM 650, commodity hardware. This shift here, that's what we called cloud, kicking off 2006 with EC2. Okay. And we have maybe other changes going on at the moment. I'll put one here. We'll call that quantum computing. Now, the thing that I often find amusing or interesting is when people talk about emerging technology, they lump quantum computing and things like cloud into the same bucket. It's like, unfortunately, we use that dreadful word innovation, and everybody goes, well, every innovation, every Genesis is an innovation, every custom built example is an innovation, every product feature is an innovation, and every shift from product to utility like cloud is an innovation. So we just scrap these labels at the bottom and the entire thing just becomes innovation, and so nobody can see anything, which is the problem that we get all the time. But the other thing we get is like this emerging technology, people mixing things, which, the way you treat cloud is completely different from the way you would treat something like quantum computing. But if you can't see the context, you never get beyond it. It's the same problem with disruption theory, same problem with horizons. If you cannot see the context, they really are hit and miss.
Awesome.
Pleasure. Sorry, any other questions? And I chat too long.
Yeah, it's actually cool. And how is mapping nation state different than mapping businesses and government?
Oh, so somebody obviously been reading my stuff. I do nation state competition, mapping of that space. So China is fascinating. I mean, China plays a brilliant game in terms of if you don't know, the general method technique is what China tends to do is when you have something, which is going to become more industrialized, China tends to play in this space, setting up what we call special economic zones, encouraging, because, you know, the big players all have inertia, so it wants to attack this space here. Special economic zones, lots of startups with funding, playing a game of last man standing in the internal market before it pushes them into the global market. So it's really focused about industrialization. And of course, that has the benefits of enabling all sorts of new things to happen. And then what China is doing is this game of basically climbing up the value chain over this end. Okay. Now, the other company, you know, in corporations, Amazon seems to be doing a brilliant job. They will never admit exactly how they play the game, but they seem to do a brilliant job. Very similar vein. And it's something I wrote about in 2005, 2006. It's called the ILC model. So very simply, you take an existing product, you turn it into a utility. A double dash, there we are. Turn it into a utility. And what you do is you allow other people to build novel and new things on top of it. Now, they're new things. We'll call this compute, and we'll call this, we'll give it a mythical name. We'll call it EC2, say. Okay. So other people build novel and new things on top. Now, the thing is, this is this uncharted space. So it's highly risky. You don't know what's going to be successful. But some of those things will start to evolve. And the interesting thing is, as they evolve, you can tell from the API data how much they're consuming your API, who's growing. So if there's a whole bunch of people doing data-y things, and then you get big data coming out of here, those players playing in that big data space you can sense just purely because of the consumption of your API. So you're not looking at their data is theirs, you're looking at your data as in your consumption. And so you can use this to basically then commoditize that, come up with, I don't know, we'll give it a mythical name, we'll call it elastic map reduce for some reason. Okay, so the game that we're playing is constantly climbing up the value chain over here. It's a very old game, wrote about it again anyway, 2005, 2006. The beauty of this model is your rate of innovation is now dependent upon the number of people building on top of all your services. Your customer focus, your rate of customer focus is mining metadata. So that depends upon the number of people building on top of your services. And your efficiency is economies of scale, which depends upon the number of people building on top of your services. So your efficiency, innovation, and customer focus simultaneously increase all at the same time as more people consume your service. So if somebody is playing this game, you're looking for a company which is becoming more innovative, apparently, more efficient, more customer focused. And the other signal is that every now and then when you do the harvesting, as we call it, some people will go, oh, they've eaten my business model, because that's exactly what you're doing, whilst others will cheer that you've provided the service for them. So this is an example of a game that you can do at a corporate level. It's one of about 100 odd patterns, if you understand your context, etc. And this particular model, we call it ILC. And I usually draw these circular diagrams to represent it with, you know, ILC. It's a particular gameplay. And this sort of gameplay you can do at nation state level as well. Does that answer your question?
Well, we need a little bit of delay to get the confirmation. It was awesome for me, but most of the people on the YouTube channel are 15 seconds later.
My apologies. I'm a bit useless at this delayed stuff and everything else. Terrible apologies from me.
Yeah, probably there's another one which is in line, like, do teams that have mapped use them to revisit subsequent action outcome to test their own doctrine, discipline? I would probably expand on this question. What is the loop? It's not only mapping once, I guess, it's going to be repeated and whenever something happens that changes your perception.
Okay, so I like to use a system of pre-mortem, post-mortem. So in UK government, we have something called spend control. Its purpose was to provide challenge. So if you're in an organization and you want to do something, the first thing I would always say is, well, before we do something, let's map it out. Because mapping it should be a quick process. I mean, an hour or so tops. And if you're going to spend any sort of money, people can spend that time mapping it out. And the point about mapping it out and sharing that map with someone else is that gives the other person the ability to challenge and question you. So you're introducing the concept of challenge and question into the organization. Now, those maps should not be thrown away. That is your pre-mortem. Which is what you should do, and the challenge should come back. And if you're building something, you could ignore the advice or ignore the challenge. If you're running the project, fair enough. But that's part of what a pre-mortem is the process of somebody giving you that challenge. But later on, after you've done whatever it is you've done, we should come back and do the post-mortem, as in, let's map out what actually happened. Because from that, several things. We can learn that maybe we took the advice or didn't take the advice, and the advice was right or the advice was wrong, or we might learn some different patterns in the process. So it should be a fairly quick exercise. So one, I like to use some sort of process of challenge with pre-mortem, post-mortem. The second thing is, of course, maps are constantly evolving. Supply and demand competition, nothing stands still, and they're not a perfect representation of a space. They can't be. So if you take geographical maps, a perfect map of France would be 1-to-1 scale, which means it would be the size of France, which means it would be France. And as a map, that is useless. Maps have to be imperfect representations of a space, but we still find them useful. So they're not static as well. Things move. Fortunately, in geographical maps, landscapes move very, very slowly. Unfortunately, in business, the landscape moves a lot faster, certainly within your lifetime, certainly in dramatic ways. The lessons from this: use them as a mechanism of challenge, communicating what you're trying to do, allow people to challenge pre and post mortem. Second, understand that it's constantly changing. So it has to be an iterative process. If you try to map out an entire industry and spent months doing it, by the time you finished, the map would have changed anyway, so there's no point. Learn to do them quickly. Kat Sweetle, fabulous speaker, one of the best speakers out there on mapping. She is truly marvelous. Talks about the importance of Wardley Maps is not the artifact, the map, it's the mapping process itself, and that's something I completely agree with.
Thumbs up on this, totally agree too. I will go for the last question, and then time is a tyrant, so here we have to close. So how often and how do you have method beyond talking to lots of people? Do you discover new climatic patterns, doctrines, and gameplays?
So right now I'm doing a research project with 11 different working groups, 5 of them covering technology changes, so things like robotics and sensors and space, things like that, and manufacturing, for example. 5 of them covering industries like healthcare, defense, finance, and one covering general needs. And what we're doing, we're looking, because of the pandemic, we know that certain changes, which were already in the happening, but very slowly, have been accelerated, which is why with the study tour that I organized, suddenly, all of those companies are heavily involved in one way or another in the pandemic, and whether it's telemedicine, use of virtual reality and robotics for remote surgeries, to whether it's manufacturing masks or whatever it happens to be. So I was already doing this project looking at this change of practice, and COVID is acting as a forcing function for the change. And what we know from past patterns is every time we get these areas industrialized, we get this new emerging practice, and some of that practice turns out to be universally useful. Some of it's very context specific. It's maybe only useful for particular industries. The concept of swarms, for example, may have application in space and other in terms of satellites and things. It may or may not have application in, say, medicine. It might do. In fact, there's stuff going on in that space, but there we are. So what happens is we normally try to get a list of about 50 practices which we think might be universally useful. And then I do a population study, which is how I created that table back in 2011, traditional next generation. And invariably, everything I think that's important turns out not to be important. So last time I did this, I thought things like collaboration, innovation were going to be the important things. Turned out it was, open source as a weapon, use of ecosystems for learning rather than analysts. Those were the things that mattered. And so all of the patterns that matter and turn out to be, or seem to be universally useful, they end up going into my doctrine table. So that doctrine table expands. Now, within it, it's organized into areas of interest. Let me just jump back. Hang on a second. It's much easier for me to show you the table. So hang on a second. Far too many slides. My apologies for the horror of that. Right. So if I go, can you see that table there, the doctrine table? Yes?
Yep.
Okay.
Sorry. Slow.
It's okay. So they're organized very simply into sort of things like this is to do with leading, this is to do with communication, but they're also organized into phases, like phase 1. These are the basic things that you absolutely should do. And then phase 2. And the way I organize them is actually I map the doctrine itself. So, for example, if you look at effectiveness over efficiency, in order to do that, we need to know the details. We need to know who the users are. We need to know what the user needs are. So this is actually built up, these different phases of implementation based upon internal mapping. So, and that's my list at the moment of about 40 doctrinal practices that are universally useful, and you really should do them all. Starting with phase 1, I mean, you just read them. I mean, challenge assumptions. It's hardly ground earth shattering, but it's amazing how few companies do it. Understand what is being considered. We really should do. Know your use. All right, this one makes me laugh. Focus on user needs. I still cannot. I'm amazed. I meet these companies, and these companies go, "Our strategy is we're going to focus on user needs." It's like, well, what the hell have you been doing? If you haven't been focusing, well, what have you been focusing on then? These are so basic. And phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, these are just universally blah. But most companies are dreadful. It's shocking. But what happens is every time we get those industrialization, and that's going on now, we get a new set of practices, so the table expands. So that's where the doctrine come from. In terms of the other patterns, what happens is I notice patterns, and some of them look to be universally useful principles. Some of them are clearly we can't alter. They're a result of the economic system and competition between many actors. So things will evolve. There's nothing we can do about that unless we can stop competition itself, which is why you could use a monopoly, as in prevent competition. And the others are gameplay, and they're all context specific. So like open source, great form of gameplay for industrializing spaces. Ecosystem models like IRC are specific type of gameplay.
Awesome.
Pleasure.
I don't know what else to say. Just a big, huge thank you. I think that was absolutely amazing. So yeah, I would really thank you for being here. Thank our audience for listening, participating, and asking a lot of very good questions. I hope I did a good job in summarizing and linking some of them. And there's a good summer for us to think about it. And thank you for this evening. And
my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me come along. I mean, really enjoyed it. And apologies if there are any funny noises from my machine, because my machine blew up last week as well. So I'm running off a 10-year-old laptop, which is creaking, I tell you. And yes, I mean, there's so much more that we can talk about in terms of the impacts. But of course, it all depends on an understanding of mapping, so I have to bring everybody to a certain point before we can talk about that sort of area. But
awesome.
If you found it useful, thank you.
Thank you very much, and we'll see you after the summer in November for the boot camp, and in the meanwhile, have a nice summer, have a nice evening. Thank you, everybody.
Pleasure.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Do you know what? I should have stopped sharing my screen beforehand. I just realized I wasn't, when I was talking, everybody could just see my table of doctrine and a voice. But there we are.